Think about the most vital ingredient in your own kitchen, the one you reach for to start almost every meal, the liquid that sizzles in the pan and forms the foundation of flavor. For us today, it might be a simple bottle of vegetable or canola oil, but for the people of ancient Rome, that indispensable substance, the very lifeblood of their cuisine, their economy, and their culture, was something far more golden and profound: olive oil. This wasn't just a cooking fat, it was a form of liquid sunshine, a symbol of peace and prosperity, a currency that fueled legions and illuminated the darkest villas. And the story of how the Romans mastered its production is a tale of brilliant engineering and relentless ambition that literally greased the wheels of an empire. It's a journey that begins not in a grand factory, but in the quiet, silvery green groves that stretched across the sun-drenched Mediterranean landscape. We often picture Rome through its marble monuments and legionaries, but the true beating heart of its power might just have been the humble olive. This simple fruit was so central to their world that its cultivation and processing became a massive industrialized operation, a level of sophistication that wouldn't be seen again for over 1,000 years. They didn't just make olive oil, they perfected it on a scale that is almost difficult to comprehend. They built factories with machinery that would feel familiar in principle to a modern engineer. They established complex trade networks that stretched from Spain to Syria, all to satisfy an insatiable demand. The Roman appetite for this liquid gold was so immense that it dictated foreign policy, funded public works, and became a measure of a man's wealth. To truly understand Rome is to follow the journey of the olive, from the moment it was gently shaken from the branch to the moment it was poured, rich and fragrant, into an amphora destined for a soldier on the frontier or a patrician's table in the city. So join us as we step back in time into the dust and heat of an ancient pressing floor. We are about to uncover the entire fascinating process from the grove to the table and reveal the ingenious and sometimes surprising methods that allowed the Romans to turn a simple fruit into one of the most powerful commodities the ancient world had ever known. This is the story of how olive oil built an empire, but before we can understand the machinery, we must first appreciate the raw material itself. The olive tree was far more than just a source of fruit to the Romans. It was a sacred symbol, deeply woven into the very fabric of their identity. This wasn't a mere crop to be harvested, but a living monument to peace, victory, and divine favor. The tree was so revered that it was sacred to Minerva, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. Legend said that she gifted the olive to the city of Athens, and in doing so, won the patronage of its people. For Rome, a civilization built on both military might and civil order, the olive became the perfect emblem. It required peace and patience to cultivate, yet its oil fueled the lamps that illuminated the work of scholars and the oil that anointed the bodies of triumphant generals. To own an olive grove was a sign of stability and wealth, a long-term investment that spoke to a family's enduring presence on the land. It was the mark of a true Roman citizen, connected to the soil and the rhythms of nature. And this connection stretched across the entire empire, from the rocky hillsides of Italy to the sun-baked plains of North Africa and the fertile valleys of Roman Spain. Different regions cultivated distinct varieties of olives, each with its own character. The most prized were the Licinian olives, named for the Licinia gens, a prominent Roman family. These were celebrated for their small size, deep black color, and exceptionally high oil yield, producing an oil considered the finest in the world, fit for the tables of emperors and the most lavish public festivals. But for the massive quantities of oil needed for daily life, for cooking, for lighting, for cleansing at the public baths, farmers relied on hardier, more abundant varieties. These olives were often harvested while still green or turning color, as this stage produced oil that was more pungent, more acidic, and crucially, had a much longer shelf life, essential for surviving long sea voyages to military outposts in Britannia or Germania. The Romans were, in effect, master blenders, understanding that the olive was not a single ingredient but a versatile fruit whose qualities could be harnessed for different purposes, from the exquisite to the utilitarian, all to sustain the immense engine of their empire. Picture the quintessential Roman farm, the fundus, not as a simple homestead, but as a carefully engineered production facility designed for one purpose: to efficiently harness the bounty of the land. The choice of location was the first and most critical decision. The Romans knew that olive trees thrived not in the rich, waterlogged soil of the river valleys, but on the sun-drenched, rocky slopes of hillsides. This preference for well-drained terrain was born of practical wisdom. Olive roots are susceptible to rot if left sitting in water, and the excellent drainage of a hillside prevented this, forcing the roots to grow deep and strong in search of moisture. Furthermore, these elevated positions caught the full force of the Mediterranean sun throughout the day, maximizing the ripening process, while the constant airflow on the slopes helped to minimize frost damage and keep harmful pests at bay. A south-facing slope was particularly prized, a natural solar panel that baked the fruit to perfection. The layout of the groves themselves reflected a sophisticated understanding of agriculture. Trees were not planted haphazardly, they were arranged in a precise quincunx pattern. Imagine the 5-spot on a dice, one tree at each corner of a square and a 5th tree in the very center. This geometric arrangement ensured each tree had ample space for its canopy to spread out and absorb sunlight, while the roots had enough room to expand without competing too fiercely with its neighbors. The typical spacing was about 25 to 40 feet between trees, a distance that seems vast to us but was essential for the long-term health of these venerable plants, which were expected to produce for centuries. But the Romans were masters of efficiency, and they rarely let land sit idle. In the wide gaps between the young olive trees, farmers practiced intercropping. They would sow rows of wheat or barley or plant grapevines to trail along lower trellises. This was a brilliant strategy. The grain crops provided a crucial annual harvest and income, while the olive trees, which take many years to mature, were still growing. The vines, meanwhile, occupied a different vertical space, their leaves soaking up sun that filtered through the higher olive canopy. This created a multi-layered, sustainable system that maximized the yield of every single acre. It was a symbiotic relationship. The grain helped to suppress weeds that would compete with the young trees, and the pruning from the vines and trees could be used as mulch or fuel. This wasn't just farming, it was a form of land-based calculus, a testament to the Roman drive to extract every ounce of potential from their world, creating a thriving, diverse agricultural ecosystem that was both productive and resilient. The success of the entire operation, from the carefully planned grove to the final precious oil, hinged on one thing: timing. The Roman farmer didn't simply watch the calendar, he lived by it, his life governed by an ancient, unyielding rhythm dictated by the sun, the soil, and the subtle changes in the fruit itself. The agricultural year for olives was a slow, patient dance, a cycle of pruning, waiting, and then a frantic burst of activity when the moment of truth finally arrived. After the flowering in late spring, the long, hot summer months were a time of quiet vigilance. The farmer would watch as the tiny, hard green olives began to swell, knowing that the intense Mediterranean sun was slowly working its magic, converting the fruit's bitter acids into the rich oils that were so highly prized. But the true crescendo of the year, the period that defined the quality and quantity of the harvest, was the late autumn and early winter. This wasn't a single day on a chart, it was a window of opportunity that required an almost intuitive sense of the land. So what were the precise signs a Roman farmer was looking for to know it was time to harvest? The most obvious indicator was color. He would walk among his trees, gently turning over the olives in his hand. The ideal fruit for the highest quality oil was not the fully ripe, deep black olive you might find on a modern table. Instead, the farmer sought the moment of veraison, the point when the olive is just beginning to turn from a grassy green to a lighter, yellowish green, often with a reddish or purplish blush on one side. This half-ripe or spotted stage was the sweet spot. Olives harvested now would yield less oil than fully black ones, but the oil they did produce was of exceptional quality, lower in acidity, brilliantly green, and packed with a sharp, peppery flavor that was highly sought after. This early harvest oil, what we might call extra virgin today, was a premium product. The farmer also judged by touch and taste. A perfectly timed olive would feel firm but not rock hard, and its skin would be taut. He might crush one between his fingers to smell the released aroma, a potent grassy scent that promised a fine oil. If he bit into it, the taste would still be intensely bitter, a sign of high polyphenol content, which acted as a natural preservative and gave the oil its character. But there would be a detectable underlying fruitiness. Waiting too long until the fruits were uniformly black and soft was a calculated risk. While a tree laden with black olives would yield a much greater volume of oil, that oil would be heavier, sweeter, and far more prone to spoilage. It was the difference between a fine, aged wine and a simple table wine. One was for connoisseurs and special occasions. The other was the bulk fuel for the empire's daily life. This critical decision, made grove by grove and tree by tree, set everything else in motion. Once the farmer gave the signal, the entire estate and often the entire region would erupt into a coordinated frenzy of activity, because the harvested fruit was a ticking clock. From the moment the olive left the branch, its quality began to degrade and the race to the pressing floor was on. With the farmer's decision made, the tranquil grove was suddenly transformed into a hive of coordinated activity. The harvest was a race against time, and it required a small army of workers to complete it efficiently. The primary tool for the bulk of the harvest was a simple, long wooden pole, often a carefully selected branch from another tree. Workers would use these poles not to violently thrash the branches, but to deliver sharp, rhythmic taps and sweeps against the laden boughs. The goal was to mimic a strong wind, judiciously vibrating the branches just enough to convince the ripest olives to let go. This method, while effective for gathering large quantities quickly, was admittedly brutal on the fruit. The falling olives would bruise upon impact, and any that landed directly on the hard ground would quickly begin to deteriorate, their damaged flesh accelerating the process of fermentation and acidification, which would ruin the quality of the oil. To combat this, the Romans employed a brilliantly simple solution. Large cloths or nets were spread out on the ground beneath the canopy of each tree. These were not mere drop cloths, they were essential pieces of technology, often made of woven goat hair or heavy linen. These sheets were positioned carefully to catch the falling harvest, creating a soft landing that preserved the integrity of the precious fruit. After a tree was beaten, the corners of the cloth would be gathered up, funneling all the olives into a central pile to be collected into baskets. This practice highlights the Roman understanding of quality control, even at this earliest stage. For the very finest oils, destined for the tables of the elite or for sacred ceremonies, an entirely different approach was taken. Here, speed was sacrificed for perfection. Workers, often the most experienced members of the family or trusted slaves, would carefully hand-pick each olive. They would gently roll individual fruits between their fingers, plucking only those that had reached the exact desired shade of variesin. This labor-intensive process ensured that every olive was unblemished, leading to an oil with the lowest possible acidity and the most delicate, complex flavors. The choice of method was a direct reflection of the oil's intended purpose, a pragmatic, scale-oriented approach for the vast quantities needed by the army and the common people, and a painstaking, artisanal one for the luxury market. This harvest was far from a solitary endeavor. It was a profoundly communal event that bound the community together. On a typical Roman farm, the entire household would be mobilized. The paterfamilias, the head of the family, would oversee the operation, while his wife and children worked alongside the estate's enslaved laborers. During the peak of the season, even additional temporary workers were hired from nearby villages, creating a bustling, almost festival-like atmosphere. The work was hard and the days were long, starting at first light and continuing until dusk, yet there was a sense of shared purpose and even celebration, often accompanied by shared meals and songs to keep morale high. The success of the harvest meant security for the coming year, oil to sell, oil to trade, and oil to sustain the household itself. This collective effort, from the youngest child gathering fallen olives to the strongest man wielding the long pole, underscores how deeply the production of olive oil was ingrained in the social and economic fabric of Roman life. It was a tangible, annual reminder that the wealth of the empire and of individual families was built not just by soldiers and senators, but by the calloused hands of those working in the groves. Once the last olive was gathered from the nets and the final baskets were filled, the real urgency began. The harvest was only half the battle. The true enemy was time itself. From the moment an olive is separated from its life-giving branch, a clock starts ticking. The fruit, now a vulnerable package of flesh and oil, begins to decay almost immediately. Enzymes within the olive start breaking it down, a process that generates heat and, most damagingly, increases the acidity of the future oil. For the Roman farmer, every hour that passed between the grove and the press was a direct threat to the quality and economic value of his entire year's work. This wasn't a leisurely journey, it was a carefully orchestrated logistical operation designed for maximum speed. The olives, carefully poured from the catching cloths, were transferred into sturdy baskets woven from willow or esparto grass. These baskets were ideal for the task. Their woven design allowed for air circulation, preventing the olives from stewing in their own moisture, yet they were strong enough to be carried, stacked, and transported without spilling the precious cargo. For very large estates or for transport over longer distances, the olives might be decanted into large sacks made of coarse hemp or jute. The key was to avoid any container that would trap heat or crush the fruit, accelerating the very spoilers they were racing against. The destination for this flowing stream of olives was the heart of the farm's industrial operation, the pressing facility. On a typical Roman farmstead, this wasn't a long journey. Efficiency dictated that the press, known as a torcularium, be located as close to the groves as possible. We often imagine these as separate buildings, and on larger villas they certainly were, but on many farms the pressing area was a central open-air workspace, often partially covered by a simple roof to protect the workers and the equipment from the elements. This proximity was a critical piece of engineering. By minimizing the distance the heavy baskets had to be carried, the Romans minimized both labor and, most importantly, the time the olives spent in transit. You can picture the scene, a steady line of workers, or perhaps a donkey-drawn cart, moving back and forth along the paths between the silver leaf trees and the dusty, stone-lined yard of the torcularium. The air would be filled with the sound of activity, the shuffle of feet, the lowing of animals, and the growing, distinctively bitter green smell of crushed olives. Before the olives could ever meet the great stone press, they had to undergo a crucial preparation stage. The baskets were emptied into a shallow, circular stone basin called a lacus. Here, the first step was a thorough cleaning. Workers would spread the olives out and carefully pick through them, removing any stray leaves, small twigs, or debris that had fallen with the harvest. These foreign objects weren't just impurities. If left in, they could impart unwanted bitter flavors to the oil during pressing. Next came the washing. Using water drawn from a nearby well or stream, the olives were rinsed to remove any dust or dirt from the field. This was a simple but vital act of quality control, ensuring the final product was pure and untainted. But the most important transformation was yet to come. The whole olive, with its hard pit still inside, is not an efficient source of oil. To liberate the precious liquid trapped within the fruit cells, the olives needed to be crushed. This was not the job of the main press, but of a specialized milling machine that was the first piece of true technology in the chain, the trappetum. This ingenious device consisted of a large, rounded stone basin, often called a mortarium, with a central vertical post. Attached to this post were two large, heavy hemispherical stones. A worker or a donkey would slowly walk in a circle, causing the stones to roll around the basin, tirelessly crushing the olives beneath their weight. The genius of the trappetum's design was its clearance. The curved stones were shaped so that they crushed the fleshy pulp of the olive, but ideally left the hard pit mostly intact. The Romans knew that crushing the pit would release bitter tannins that could spoil the oil's flavor. This careful milling created a thick, fragrant paste, a coarse amalgamation of oil, fruit water, and pulp, now perfectly prepared for the final, most dramatic act of extraction. With the olives safely delivered to the pressing floor, the focus shifted from speed to precision. The first order of business was a thorough cleaning, a crucial step that separated a fine, marketable oil from a rustic, low-grade product. Workers would spread the newly arrived harvest across the flat stone surface of the lacus, the shallow basin, and begin the meticulous task of sorting. They would pick through the piles by hand, removing every stray leaf, tiny twig, and piece of debris that had fallen from the trees along with the fruit. This wasn't just about aesthetics. Leaving these impurities in would have serious consequences during the pressing stage. Leaves in particular contain chlorophyll and other compounds that, when crushed and heated, can introduce grassy, off flavors and an undesirable bitterness into the oil. This careful culling was the first act of quality control, a physical manifestation of the Roman pursuit of a pure, clean-tasting final product. Next, the olives were washed. Using buckets of fresh water, workers would rinse the fruit, sluicing away any dust, dirt, or field soil that clung to the skins. This simple act ensured that the fundamental flavor of the oil would be the essence of the olive itself, and not the earth it grew in. Once cleaned and rinsed, the olives were ready for their first major transformation, moving from whole fruit to a substance that would release their precious oil. This transformation was accomplished by one of the most iconic pieces of technology in the entire Roman agricultural world, the trappetum. Imagine a large circular stone basin, typically made from a single block of hard volcanic rock with a deep, curved interior. Rising from the center of this basin was a sturdy vertical wooden or iron pivot. Attached to this central pivot were two massive hemispherical stones, each carefully shaped like a half sphere or a giant nutmeg. These were the grinding stones, and they were not fixed rigidly. They were suspended in such a way that they could roll freely around the basin. The genius of the trappetum's design lay in its specific geometry. The curvature of the grinding stones perfectly matched the curvature of the basin, but with a critical gap left between them. This gap was the secret to its success. An animal, usually a blindfolded donkey to keep it from becoming dizzy, would be harnessed to a horizontal beam attached to the central pivot. As the donkey walked in a slow, endless circle, it turned the beam, which in turn caused the two heavy stone wheels to roll around the basin, crushing the olives that had been poured inside. The objective was not to pulverize the olives into a homogeneous mush. The true goal was to tear open the thousands of tiny oil-containing cells within the olive's flesh while carefully avoiding the hard pit at its center. The Romans understood that crushing the pit would release bitter-tasting tannins that would contaminate the oil, giving it an astringent, unpleasant flavor. The carefully calibrated gap in the trappetum was engineered to achieve exactly this. The rolling stones would apply enough pressure to thoroughly mash the pulp into a coarse, fragrant paste, but they would largely leave the pits whole or only lightly cracked. You can almost hear the operation, the steady, rhythmic sound of the stones grinding against the basin, the shuffle of the donkey's hooves on the packed earth, and the rising, pungent aroma of freshly crushed olives, a smell that is both fruity and intensely green. The resulting paste was a rough, moist amalgamation of olive pulp, a small amount of free-run oil, and the fruit's natural water. This paste was then scooped out of the trappetum and collected into baskets, ready for the most critical stage of the entire process, the extraction of the oil itself. This milling process was a perfect example of Roman practical engineering, applying simple principles of leverage and geometry to solve a complex problem of food science, ensuring that the first liquid gold to emerge would be of the highest possible quality. Now we arrive at the dramatic climax of the entire operation, the moment where brute force and delicate technique combined to literally squeeze wealth from the prepared paste. This was the domain of the press itself, a piece of machinery that evolved significantly throughout Roman history, reflecting their relentless drive for efficiency and higher yields. The earliest presses were straightforward but powerful applications of leverage. Imagine a massive horizontal wooden beam, one end anchored firmly into a niche in a stone wall. The other end hung free. The olive paste, having been milled in the trappetum, was not simply dumped into a container. Instead, it was carefully scooped and spread onto round, flat mats made of woven fibers, often esparto grass or horsehair. These mats were incredibly important. They were porous enough to let the liquids flow through, but strong enough to hold the thick paste under immense pressure. A worker would place one mat on a stone base, pile on a layer of paste, then place another mat on top, creating a stack that could be several layers high. This entire stack, called a ficina, was then positioned directly beneath the free end of the great wooden beam. To apply pressure, massive stone weights were hung from the beam, slowly forcing it downward and compressing the stack of mats. The initial trickle that emerged was the finest oil, forced out by the first application of weight. This simple lever press was effective, but it had limitations. The amount of pressure was largely determined by the sheer mass of the stones you could hang, and controlling that pressure with any finesse was difficult. The Roman engineering spirit, however, was never satisfied with the simple for long. Their major innovation, one that revolutionized olive oil production across the Mediterranean, was the introduction of the screw press. This was a game changer. Instead of relying on hanging weights, the screw press used a massive wooden screw, turned by a long handspike, to apply downward force directly onto the stack of mats. The principle was simple, but its impact was profound. With a few men walking in a circle to turn the screw, they could generate a degree of pressure that was both greater and, crucially, far more controllable than anything possible with a lever and weights. The operator could increase the pressure gradually, first squeezing out the highest quality free-run oil, and then steadily cranking down to extract every last drop from the pulp. This control was vital for quality. Applying too much pressure too quickly could heat the paste excessively or even crush the olive pits that had been so carefully preserved in the milling stage, releasing those bitter tannins and ruining the entire batch. The screw press allowed for a slow, steady, and measured extraction, maximizing yield without sacrificing the delicate flavors of the oil. The typical setup involved a sturdy stone base with channels carved into it to guide the flowing liquids away. The stack of mats filled with paste was placed in the center and a large wooden cap was positioned on top. The central screw, which passed to a fixed beam above, would then be turned, pressing the cap down onto the stack. The creak of the wooden screw and the groaning of the fibers under stress would have been the soundtrack of the pressing season. As the pressure mounted, a stream of liquid, a mixture of oil and the olive's own vegetal water, would seep through the woven mats, run down the grooves in the stone base and collect in a waiting basin. This invention didn't just make more oil, it made better oil, and it did so with less waste and more predictable results. A perfect example of how Roman technological ingenuity was directly applied to boosting economic output. But the stream of liquid now flowing from the press was not a single uniform product. The Romans, with their characteristic eye for classification and commerce, understood that the quality of oil varied dramatically depending on when it was extracted during the pressing cycle. This led to the sophisticated practice of multiple pressings, a deliberate and careful process that sorted the oil into distinct grades, each with its own purpose and price point. The very first liquid to seep out, even before the full weight of the press was applied, was the most precious. This was the free-run oil, produced by the gentle pressure of the mats simply being stacked upon one another. When the full force of the screw or lever was then gradually applied, this initial extraction yielded the finest grade of all, oleum ex albis olivis, or oil from green olives. This oil was strikingly green, almost fluorescent, with an intensely peppery flavor and a remarkable low level of acidity. It was the equivalent of our modern extra virgin olive oil, a premium product destined for the tables of the wealthy, used for dressing delicate salads, drizzling over fine breads, or as a finishing touch to gourmet dishes. Its aroma was fresh and fruity, a direct expression of the carefully harvested fruit, and it was so valued that it was sometimes even used in the most sacred religious ceremonies, an offering deemed pure enough for the gods. After this virgin oil was collected, the press was not done. The stack of fibrous mats still held a significant amount of oil trapped within the damp pulp. To recover this valuable resource, the Romans would perform a second pressing, but this time they introduced a new element, hot water. Workers would pour heated water over the pressed cake of olive paste still contained within the mats. This served two purposes. First, the water helped to loosen the remaining oil, making it easier to extract. Second, and more crucially, the heat lowered the viscosity of the oil, allowing it to flow more freely. However, this process came with a trade-off. The hot water also pulled out more impurities, soluble compounds, and bitter tannins from the already broken-down pulp. The oil from this second pressing was of a noticeably lower quality. It was paler in color, often a dull gold or light yellow, and had a much milder, flatter flavor. It lacked the vibrant character of the first press oil and had a higher acidity. This second-grade oil was the workhorse of the Roman world. It was perfectly suitable for everyday cooking, fueling the lamps that lit homes and public buildings, and for personal grooming at the baths, where it was used as a moisturizer and cleansing agent. There was often even a third, final pressing, a true effort to leave no drop behind. The same cake of pulp would be doused with even more hot water and subjected to the maximum pressure the press could muster. The resulting liquid was a low-grade murky oil, often bordering on rancid. This third-quality oil had limited culinary use but found a purpose in industrial applications. It was used as a base for soap, as a lubricant for machinery and wagon axles, and even as a fuel for primitive torches. This tiered system of pressing demonstrates a remarkably efficient and waste-conscious approach. Nothing from the valuable olive was discarded. Every part of the harvest was leveraged to its full economic potential, creating a product spectrum that serviced every level of Roman society, from the imperial palace to the common soldier's mess kit. The entire process was a masterclass in resource management, turning a single batch of olive paste into a range of commodities that fueled not just lamps and kitchens, but the very economy of the empire. The pressing stage was a triumph of engineering, but the liquid it produced was far from the pure golden oil we might imagine. What flowed from the press and into the collection basin was a murky, turbulent mixture, a combination of the precious oil, the bitter-tasting vegetal water naturally present in the fruit, and a fine silt of solid pulp particles. To the untrained eye, it would have looked like a failed batch, a cloudy, unappetizing slurry. Yet the Romans possessed a deep understanding of a fundamental physical principle they could use to solve this problem without any complex machinery: the simple, relentless force of gravity. They knew that if they could just create the right conditions for calm, the different components of this mixture would naturally separate on their own, with the oil being lighter, inevitably rising to the top. This final purification took place in a series of specialized containers known as settling vats. These were typically shallow, open-top tanks made of stone, pottery, or sometimes even waterproof concrete, arranged in a sequence next to the pressing area. The freshly pressed liquid was carefully channeled from the press's collection basin into the first of these vats. Here, the coarsest separation began. Almost immediately, the heavier solid particles, tiny fragments of pulp and skin, would begin to sink to the bottom, forming a soft sludge. But the real magic happened over the next several hours or even a full day, as the liquid was allowed to rest completely undisturbed. The key was patience. Any agitation, whether from a stirred ladle or a jostled vat, would mix the oil and water back together, undoing all the progress. The Romans understood that time was their greatest ally in this final step. As the mixture sat in perfect stillness, gravity worked its methodical magic. The denser water, along with any remaining fine sediment, slowly sank downward. Meanwhile, the lighter olive oil, droplet by droplet, migrated upward, coalescing into a growing layer on the surface. After a sufficient period, the contents of the vat will be visibly stratified into three distinct bands. At the very bottom lay the dark, muddy lees, the waste product of the process. Above that was a clear layer of now separated vegetal water, and floating proudly on top was a gleaming golden-green layer of pure olive oil. The final act of this ancient alchemy was the skillful work of a laborer armed with a specially designed ladle. This wasn't an ordinary kitchen utensil. It was a shallow, wide-bowled scoop, often made of bronze or a fine ceramic. With a remarkably steady hand, the worker would gently skim this ladle across the surface of the vat, carefully collecting only the top layer of oil without dipping into the water below. This required a delicate touch and a keen eye, as breaking the surface tension too deeply would contaminate the entire batch. The skimmed oil was then decanted into another clean settling vat for a second, final round of resting, ensuring that any last traces of moisture or sediment were removed. This patient, low-tech method of separation was a testament to the Roman mastery of natural processes. They didn't need centrifuges or filters. They had perfected the art of waiting, using the immutable laws of physics to transform a turbid pressings into the brilliant, market-ready liquid gold that would soon be poured into amphorae and shipped to every corner of the empire. Stepping into a Roman torcularium was not like entering a simple shed. It was walking onto the factory floor of a sophisticated agro-business. The entire structure was purpose-built, an architectural machine designed around the single goal of turning olives into oil with maximum efficiency. While its appearance could vary from a modest farmstead building to an industrial complex on a large villa, the layout always followed a logical and unvarying sequence that mirrored the production process itself. The building was typically long and rectangular, often partially open to the air or with a high, sloped roof to allow smoke and the potent smell of the harvest to escape. Underfoot, the floor was often made of packed earth or stone flagstones, durable enough to withstand heavy traffic and the inevitable spills of oily residue. The tour would logically begin at the receiving area, usually near the main entrance. This is where the baskets and sacks of olives, fresh from the groves, would be unloaded and poured into the large, shallow lacas for that essential initial cleaning. Adjacent to this would be the milling section, the home of the mighty trappadum. This machine was so heavy and generated such vibration that its stone basin was often set directly onto a specially reinforced foundation, sometimes even set into the ground itself for stability. The space around the trapedum needed to be clear for the donkey to walk its endless circle, and you would often find storage for the woven mats and baskets used to transport the resulting paste. The heart of the torcularium, both visually and functionally, was the pressing area. This is where the architecture became most impressive. The main press, whether a lever or screw type, required immense structural strength. The anchoring point for a lever press was not a simple wooden post. It was often a massive integral stone pillar built right into the wall, capable of withstanding the tremendous torque generated by the weighted beam. For the more advanced screw presses, the ceiling beams had to be exceptionally thick and sturdy to support the downward force of the screw mechanism. The floor beneath the press was equally important. It wasn't flat, it was carefully engineered with a slight slope and carved with a network of shallow channels. These grooves acted like miniature aqueducts, catching the precious liquid as it streamed from the pressed mats and guiding it efficiently toward the collection basin. This simple feature prevented waste and kept the work area manageable. The collection basin itself, typically a large, rounded stone vessel called a labrum, was set into the floor at the lowest point of this system. Finally, the tour would conclude at the battery of decantation vats. These were usually lined up along a wall, away from the bustle of the pressing action to ensure they remained perfectly still. A larger facility might have a whole series of these vats, allowing for a continuous flow of production where one batch could be settling while another was being pressed. The vats were often interconnected by small terracotta pipes or channels, allowing the freshly pressed mixture to flow by gravity from the labrum into the first settling tank. The strategic placement of these vats, often in a slightly cooler part of the building, helped to slow down any fermentation and aided the separation process. The entire layout of the torcularium was a masterclass in ergonomic design long before the word existed. The workflow moved in one direction, from the dirty olives at the entrance to the pure, golden oil at the far end, with no unnecessary steps or backtracking. Every architectural choice, from the reinforced walls to the sloped, channeled floors, served the relentless pursuit of quantity and quality, turning a building into a powerful engine of Roman economic might. Now, with the oil finally separated and shimmering in its settling vats, the product was ready, but this liquid gold was of no use to the empire if it couldn't travel. For a commodity destined to be shipped across thousands of miles of land and sea, from the sunny presses of Hispania to the damp frontiers of Britannia, the choice of container was as critical as the quality of the oil itself. The Romans found their perfect solution in an object so simple, so versatile, that it became a symbol of their commercial reach, the amphora. This was not just a pot, it was the intermodal shipping container of the ancient world, a masterpiece of ceramic engineering designed for one purpose: to get its precious contents to their destination safely, efficiently, and in a recognizable, standardized form. Imagine holding one of these vessels, the most famous type for transporting olive oil, especially from the prolific groves of Roman Spain, was the Dressel 20. It's a name given by modern archaeologists, but it describes a form that would have been instantly familiar to any Roman dockworker. This was a large, sturdy jar, typically holding around 70 liters, or about 18.5 gallons of oil. Its shape was a study in practical design. It featured a rounded, almost spherical body that provided strength and resisted cracking under pressure, but the most distinctive features were on the ends. At the top, instead of a wide open mouth, it had a relatively narrow neck, topped with two robust handles. This design made it easy for two people to carry the heavy, sloshing jar when it was full. The real genius, however, was at the base. Instead of being flat, the bottom of a Dressel 20 amphora came to a pointed, conical tip. At first glance, this seems counterintuitive. How do you stand up a jar with a pointy bottom? The answer lies in its life on a ship. In the hold of a Roman merchant vessel, these amphorae were not meant to stand upright on a flat surface. Instead, they were packed tightly together, nestled side by side, with their pointed bases fitting securely into the gaps between the rounded shoulders of the jars in the row below. This created an incredibly stable, interlocked cargo that could withstand the violent pitching and rolling of a sea voyage without shifting and shattering. On land, a simple wooden stand or a hole dug in the ground would support the amphora for storage. Sealing this valuable cargo was a two-step process that showcased Roman understanding of preservation. Once the amphora was filled, a disc of cork, harvested from the bark of cork oak trees, was carefully fitted into the neck as a stopper. Cork was the ideal material. It was lightweight, impermeable to liquids, and slightly flexible, creating a tight seal that expanded and contracted with temperature changes. But the Romans didn't stop there. To make the seal absolutely airtight and waterproof, they would then pour a thick layer of hot pitch over the cork stopper and down the neck of the amphora. This pitch, a tar-like substance derived from pine resin, would harden into a solid, durable cap, locking the oil inside and protecting it from air and contaminants. This was the ancient equivalent of a tamper evidence seal, but the identification went even further. Before the clay was even fired, the amphora was often stamped with a maker's mark, usually on one of the handles. This stamp might include the name of the estate owner, the potter who made the jar, or the merchant responsible for the shipment. In an era before barcodes and printed labels, this was a vital system of branding and accountability. If an amphora broke or the oil was of poor quality, you could trace it back to its source. These stamped handles, scattered across the archaeological sites of the empire, are like ancient business cards, allowing historians to map out intricate trade routes and identify the major players in the olive oil industry. The humble amphora was far more than a passive container. It was an active component of Roman commerce, its very shape and markings enabling a logistical network that connected the entire Mediterranean world. So this carefully sealed amphora, stamped with the mark of an estate in Hispania Baetica, is now more than just a container. It is a unit of commerce, ready for its long and perilous journey. Its voyage begins on a dusty cart, trundling from the inland pressing facility to one of the major river ports, most likely on the Great Beatties River, known today as the Guadalquivir. This river was the primary artery for the entire region, a liquid highway that carried the wealth of the Spanish interior down to the coast. At the port city of Hispalis, modern-day Seville, our amphora would be unloaded onto the bustling docks, a chaotic symphony of shouts, creaking wood, and the smell of salt water and tar. Here it would be carefully counted and registered by customs officials before being handed over to the crew of a merchant ship, a vessel known as a corbeta. These ships were the heavy freighters of their day, wide-bellied and reliant primarily on a single large square sail, designed for carrying massive cargoes rather than for speed. The most common and safest route to Italy was a carefully choreographed coastal voyage, a testament to the Roman respect for the sea's dangers. Instead of striking out directly across the open Mediterranean, the ship would first sail south and east, hugging the coastline of North Africa. This path took advantage of predictable coastal winds and allowed for frequent stops at established ports like Carthago Nova in Spain and then Lixus in Mauritania. These stops were essential for taking on fresh water and supplies, but also for making necessary repairs. The constant pounding of the waves on a wooden hull could loosen planks and caulking, making a journey without such havens incredibly risky. From North Africa, the ship would then make the relatively short open water crossing to the islands of Sardinia and Corsica, using them as stepping stones before making the final run down the western coast of Italy to the ultimate destination, the port of Ostia, the bustling maritime gateway to Rome itself. But this journey was anything but a leisurely cruise. The sea was an unpredictable and hostile environment. The greatest threat was the sudden Mediterranean storm, which could whip up terrifying waves capable of swamping a laden ship or driving it violently onto a rocky shore. Pirates were a constant concern in less patrolled waters, eager to seize a valuable cargo. There were also the silent, hidden dangers of reefs and shoals, and the ever-present risk of structural failure in the ship itself. A single cracked amphora, if it contained wine, might be a minor loss, but a leaking oil amphora could spoil the entire cargo hold, as the rancid oil would contaminate everything it touched. For every ship that successfully made it to Ostia, countless others ended their journey on the seafloor, their cargoes lost for centuries, creating the underwater archaeological museums we study today. The successful arrival at Ostia was a cause for celebration for the ship's owner and captain. The cargo was now tantalizingly close to its final market, but it still had one more crucial leg of the journey to complete. Upon arrival at Ostia, our amphora, along with thousands of its companions, was unloaded onto the chaotic, sprawling docks. Here it underwent another round of inspection and taxation. Roman customs agents would check the seals and assess the quality of the oil, often by tasting a sample, before imposing the required port duties. Once cleared, the amphorae faced a final logistical challenge. While Ostia was Rome's port, it was still about 15 miles from the city itself. The most efficient way to move such heavy, bulky goods the final distance was by barge, not by cart. The amphorae were transferred onto flat-bottomed riverboats that were towed up the Tiber River by teams of oxen or men walking along the towpaths on the riverbank. This slow, steady progress up the Tiber was the last peaceful stage of the journey, a quiet contrast to the turbulent sea voyage. The final destination for our Spanish amphora, and for millions just like it, was not a market stall or a wealthy villa, but something far more astonishing, a man-made mountain of broken pottery known as Monte Testaccio. This is not a natural hill, it is an ancient landfill, a sprawling mound located near the Tiber wharves in Rome. For over 200 years, from the 1st to the 3rd centuries, this was the designated dumping ground for the empire's olive oil amphorae. But why create such a massive refuse pile? The answer lies in the amphora's design. While its pointed base was perfect for maritime transport, it was terribly inconvenient for storage in a warehouse. You couldn't simply stand it on a shelf. More importantly, the porous clay of the amphora was almost impossible to clean thoroughly once the oil was emptied out. The residual oil would quickly turn rancid, meaning the jars could not be safely reused for storing food or liquids. They were, in effect, single-use containers on an imperial scale. The disposal process at Monte Testaccio was surprisingly systematic. Workers would deliberately break the empty amphorae and then carefully stack the shards, mixing them with lime to neutralize the smell of the rotting oil residue and to prevent the pile from becoming a public health hazard. They created a vast layered structure of pottery and mortar. Today, Monte Testaccio stands over 100 feet high and contains the fragments of an estimated 53 million amphorae. That single hill represents about 6 billion liters of olive oil consumed by the city of Rome. For archaeologists, it is a treasure trove, a layered history book. The stamped handles on the broken shards allow them to trace the rise and fall of specific estates, to understand trade fluctuations, and to see the sheer, staggering scale of Rome's appetite. The journey of our single amphora from a sun-drenched Spanish grove concludes here, in this artificial mountain on the outskirts of the world's first megalopolis, its empty shell becoming a permanent part of the physical fabric of the empire it helped to feed, fuel, and enrich. But the story of Monte Testaccio is far more than just a tale of ancient trash disposal. This man-made mountain is, in fact, one of the most detailed and revealing economic records ever left behind by the Roman world. It functions as a giant stratified ledger, a physical archive of imperial commerce. What makes it truly extraordinary are the inscriptions found on the broken pottery fragments, known as tituli picti. These weren't stamped into the clay before firing like the maker's marks on the handles. These were labels painted or inked onto the amphorae after they were filled, at the point of shipment. They are the ancient equivalent of a modern shipping manifest, and they provide a breathtakingly detailed snapshot of the oil trade. The information on these labels was remarkably standardized, often written in a kind of bureaucratic shorthand that modern scholars have painstakingly decoded. A typical titulus pictus might contain several lines of crucial data. First, it often listed the weight of the amphora when empty, and then again when full. This wasn't just for accounting, it was a fundamental measure of the oil's quantity and, by extension, its value for tax purposes. Next, and perhaps most importantly, it named the merchant or the mercator who was shipping the goods and the estate or region of origin. We can trace specific shipments back to known wealthy families who owned vast tracts of olive groves in southern Spain, turning abstract historical figures into tangible economic players. The labels also frequently included the name of the official who inspected and approved the cargo, a clear system of accountability. But one of the most fascinating details is the consistent recording of the consular year. The Romans dated things not by a numbered year like we do, but by naming the two consuls who held office that year. So an amphora might be inscribed with the names of the consuls for, say, 150 AD. This precise dating is an archaeologist's dream. It means that as you dig into the layers of Monte Testaccio, you are literally moving backwards or forwards through time with incredible accuracy. The hill is not a random jumble, it's a carefully documented timeline of Roman consumption over centuries, allowing historians to see the ebbs and flows of trade, to identify boom years and periods of crisis. This mountain of shards also speaks volumes about Roman quality control and the concept of a brand. The very act of inscribing the merchant's name and the estate of origin created a chain of responsibility. If a shipment of oil arrived in Rome and was found to be rancid or adulterated, the officials could trace it back through the tituli picti to the specific shipper. This system incentivized honesty and maintained a certain standard for a commodity that was vital to the city's survival. It suggests a level of commercial sophistication where reputation mattered, even in a state-controlled market. Furthermore, the analysis of the pottery itself reveals another layer of industrial efficiency. The amphorae from a particular region, like Hispania Baetica, are remarkably uniform in their shape and capacity. This standardization implies a high degree of organization, likely with large, central pottery workshops producing these containers by the thousands to a set specification. This wasn't casual local production, it was an industry supporting an industry, all geared toward feeding the insatiable appetite of the capital. So while Monte Testaccio is literally a garbage dump, it is also a monument to Roman bureaucracy, trade networks, and the sheer, overwhelming scale of their economic engine. It stands as silent, crumbling proof that the Roman Empire was, in many ways, built as much by merchants and accountants with their careful ledgers as it was by legionaries with their swords. This meticulous production process, with its multiple pressings and careful separation, wasn't just about efficiency. It was designed to create a spectrum of products that serviced every possible need of Roman society. The Romans were masters of classification, and they developed a sophisticated grading system for olive oil that was as detailed as any modern food standard. The quality of the oil determined its price, its purpose, and even its social standing, creating a clear hierarchy from the exquisite to the utilitarian. At the absolute pinnacle of this hierarchy was the oil known as oleum ex albis olivis, oil from white olives. This name is a bit misleading to our ears as it didn't come from white fruit, but rather from olives harvested at the very earliest stage of ripeness when they were a pale, greenish yellow. This was the Roman equivalent of our modern extra virgin olive oil, and it was a product of extraordinary care, made from hand-selected, unbruised olives that were cold-pressed using only the initial, gentle application of weight. This oil was a vibrant, almost fluorescent green. Its flavor profile was intense and complex, sharply peppery, with a distinct fruitiness and a notable kick at the back of the throat, a characteristic known as pizzica that was highly prized. This premier grade had the lowest acidity and the highest concentration of antioxidants, giving it a relatively long shelf life and making it the only oil considered pure enough for consumption in its raw state. It was never used for cooking, as heat would destroy its delicate aromas. Instead, it was reserved as a finishing oil, drizzled over dishes at the table. It accompanied delicate cheeses, was poured over fresh bread, and was the base for the most refined salad dressings and sauces, like garum-based concoctions. Its use was a clear sign of wealth and refinement, a sensory experience that marked a meal as special. So valued was this grade that it also had a sacred role, used as an anointing oil in religious ceremonies and as a base for the most expensive perfumes, its purity making it a fitting offering to the gods. The workhorse of the Roman kitchen and the most common oil found in a typical household was the grade produced from the main, stronger pressing of ripe or slightly overripe olives. This oil, which might be broadly categorized as oleum virid or green oil, though the term was used loosely, was the standard cooking fat. It was typically a golden yellow color with a milder, less complex flavor and a higher acidity than the premier grade. Its more robust nature made it ideal for frying, sautéing, and roasting, the foundational techniques of daily Roman cuisine. It was this oil that sizzled in the pans, cooking lentils, frying fish, and browning meats. It was also the primary ingredient in the preservation of foods, used to pack cheeses, vegetables, and even certain types of fish in amphorae, creating an airtight seal that prevented spoilage. For the vast majority of Romans, from the soldier in his barracks to the merchant's family in their city apartment, this was the oil they knew and used every day. It was affordable, versatile, and available in enormous quantities, forming the caloric and flavorful backbone of the Roman diet. Its quality could vary widely depending on the source and the care taken during production, but it was always a step above the lowest tiers, fit for human consumption and central to the culinary identity of the empire. Beyond the kitchen, olive oil's utility expanded into realms that might surprise us today. The next grade down, often from a second or third pressing with hot water, was considered unfit for eating but perfect for illumination. This lamp oil, sometimes called oleum cibarium, was a dull, pale yellow and often had a slightly rancid smell. It was the fuel that lit the darkness of the ancient world. Poured into millions of simple clay lamps, this oil burned with a smoky, flickering flame that illuminated homes, shops, public buildings, and the tents of military camps across the empire. The demand for oil for this purpose was staggering, accounting for a significant portion of the total consumption. Its use extended to personal grooming as well. At the public baths, a fundamental part of Roman social life, bathers would use this lower-grade oil as a cleanser. They would rub it all over their bodies, then use a strigil, a curved metal tool, to scrape away the oil along with the dirt, sweat, and dead skin. While the wealthy might have used finer oils for this purpose, the average citizen relied on the same oil that fueled the lamps. This practice was so common that the amount of oil a town consumed for its baths became a rough indicator of its size and prosperity. Finally, at the very bottom of the quality scale was oil that was frankly rancid, murky, and acidic. This was the industrial-grade oil, a commodity that found its way into a surprising number of non-culinary applications. It was a key ingredient in the production of soap, often mixed with alkaline substances like wood ash or natron. Tanners used it in the process of curing and softening leather, the oil helping to make the hides supple. It served as a lubricant for the axles of carts and wagons, for the moving parts of machinery like water-lifting devices, and even for hinges. In agriculture, it was sometimes mixed with other substances to create primitive pesticides. In a sense, nothing was wasted. Even the oil that was no longer palatable was still a valuable chemical resource. This tiered system, from the gourmet to the grimy, demonstrates a remarkable and comprehensive understanding of a single resource. The Romans didn't just see olive oil as food, they saw it as a multifunctional substance whose value could be extracted at every level of quality, ensuring that every single drop of the liquid gold served a purpose in the great engine of their civilization. Now, with our amphora of oil finally arriving in Rome, let's follow it from the warehouse to the kitchen, where this liquid gold truly earned its name. In the Roman world, olive oil was far more than just a cooking fat. It was the foundational flavor of their entire cuisine, the indispensable ingredient that started nearly every meal. Picture a Roman cook at a charcoal-fired stove, a simple masonry structure known as a focus. The very first thing they would do, just as many chefs do today, was to pour a generous amount of oil into a bronze or earthenware pan. That sizzle as it hit the hot metal was the sound of a Roman kitchen coming to life. It was used for frying fish, sautéing vegetables, and browning all manner of meats. But perhaps its most critical culinary role was as a preservative. In a world without refrigeration, olive oil was a vital tool for survival. Cheeses, vegetables, and even cooked meats were submerged in jars of oil, creating an airtight seal that protected them from spoilage for months, allowing flavors to mature and providing food security throughout the year. Yet the true magic happened when oil was combined with other ingredients to create complex sauces and dressings. The most famous, and to our modern palates perhaps the most challenging, of these was garum or liquemen, a fermented fish sauce that was the Roman equivalent of ketchup or soy sauce. But garum was almost never used alone. It was almost always mixed with olive oil, wine, and vinegar to create the vibrant dressings and marinades that characterized Roman food. To understand this combination, we can turn to one of the most remarkable documents to survive from antiquity, the cookbook attributed to Apicius. This collection of recipes gives us a direct window into the Roman palate. One recipe for a simple yet elegant dish instructs: pour over the cooked vegetables oil and a good garum. This basic formula, oil and garum, was the starting point for countless variations. Another recipe for a sauce for boiled meats calls for a mixture of pepper, lovage, oregano, onion, wine, a little vinegar, and the necessary oil and garum. The oil here acts as the carrier, the rich, smooth base that balanced the intense saltiness of the fish sauce, and the sharp acidity of the vinegar, emulsifying everything into a cohesive dressing that would cling to the food. Baking too relied heavily on olive oil, though in a way that might surprise us. While they did not have butter in the same way we do, Romans used oil to create rich, moist breads and cakes. Apicius describes a honey and pepper cake where the flour is mixed with oil, milk, pepper, and bay leaves before being baked. Oil was brushed on dough to create a golden, crisp crust, and it was used to grease baking pans, just as we do today. But the use of oil extended far beyond the cooked dish. It was at the table where its finest qualities were showcased. The highest grade of oil, the oleum ex albis olevis, was treated with the reverence of a fine condiment. It would be presented in a small, elegant crute, often made of glass, so guests could admire its vibrant green color. Diners would drizzle this premium oil over their bread, much as we do now, but also over simple dishes of legumes like lentils or chickpeas, elevating them with its fruity, peppery notes. A salad of fresh herbs, known as acetaria, would be dressed with nothing more than a splash of this exquisite oil, a little vinegar, and a pinch of salt, allowing the quality of the oil itself to shine. This practice of finishing a dish at the table highlights how the Romans appreciated the nuanced flavors of a great oil, understanding that its most delicate aromas were best preserved without being subjected to heat. From the first sizzle in the pan to the final drizzle at the table, olive oil was the constant unifying thread in the rich tapestry of Roman cuisine, a flavor that defined an era and a taste that still resonates on our plates today. But the journey of Roman olive oil did not end at the dinner table. Its golden stream flowed into nearly every aspect of daily life, becoming as essential to religion, beauty, and cleanliness as it was to cooking. In the spiritual realm, olive oil was considered a substance of pure divine power. It was the preferred offering or libation to the gods. A Roman priest or a head of household would pour a small amount of the finest oil onto an altar flame or directly onto a sacred stone. The flicker of the flame as it consumed the oil was seen as a direct conduit to the divine, a fragrant smoke carrying prayers and thanks upwards. Statues of gods, especially those of Minerva, the patroness of the olive tree, were ritually anointed with oil to keep them lustrous and to honor their presence. This sacred use highlights how the olive was perceived as a gift from the gods themselves, and returning its purest essence was a fundamental act of piety, connecting the practical world of farming to the mystical realm of the heavens. In the very personal sphere of hygiene and grooming, olive oil was the cornerstone of Roman self-care. Long before modern soaps and lotions, it was the ultimate multi-purpose balm. After a bath or a workout at the gymnasium, Romans would massage oil into their skin as a moisturizer, protecting it from the dry Mediterranean climate and leaving it feeling soft and supple. It formed the base for countless perfumes and unguents. Fragrant herbs, flowers, and spices would be steeped in high-quality oil for days or weeks, infusing it with their scents to create luxurious lotions. A Roman man or woman of means might have a collection of these scented oils for different occasions, a light rose or saffron scent for a dinner party, perhaps a more earthy myrtle or cedar wood fragrance for daily wear. This practice was so ingrained that small, delicate glass bottles called unguentaria for storing these precious oils are common finds in archaeological excavations, a testament to the importance of personal aroma in Roman society. The most iconic and widespread use of oil for cleanliness, however, was central to the Roman bathing ritual, an experience that was both social and practical. Stepping into the hot, steamy rooms of the public baths, a bather would first work up a sweat to open their pores. Then they would cover their entire body in a layer of olive oil. This wasn't the fine first-press oil from the kitchen. This was typically a lower-grade, more affordable oil, often scented with simple, inexpensive herbs. The oil served a crucial purpose. It acted as a solvent. As the bather relaxed, the oil would mix with the sweat and grime accumulated from a day in the dusty city or from physical labor. The next step involved the most distinctive tool of Roman bathing, the strigil. This was a curved metal implement, usually made of bronze or iron, with a handle at one end and a dull, concave blade at the other. The bather, or often a servant or slave, would use the strigil to scrape the oil, along with the now liquefied dirt and dead skin, off the body. The combination of oil and strigil was remarkably effective. It exfoliated the skin, leaving it clean and smooth, while the oil prevented the strigil from scraping or irritating the skin. You can almost hear the soft scraping sound as the strigil glided over the skin, collecting the messy mixture of oil and grime, which would be wiped off the blade into a small vessel. This entire process was a testament to Roman practicality. It was a water-efficient cleaning method in a world where fresh water was sometimes scarce, and it turned a basic hygienic act into a refined, almost ritualistic experience that was enjoyed by citizens from all walks of life, solidifying olive oil's role as the indispensable liquid that maintained not just the empire's stomach, but its very body and spirit. To understand how olive oil truly greased the wheels of the Roman Empire, we need to look past the kitchen and the bathhouse and into the ledgers of the state itself. The production of this liquid gold was not merely a cottage industry, it was a colossal economic engine that generated fortunes, funded the government, and helped maintain social order on a massive scale. At the heart of this system were the vast agricultural estates known as latifundia. These were not the small, family-run farms we imagined earlier, but enormous tracts of land, often spanning thousands of acres, owned by the senatorial elite or the emperor himself. Picture a landscape in southern Spain or North Africa that stretched as far as the eye could see, a monoculture of silvery green olive trees, all owned by a single absentee landlord living in a luxurious villa in Rome. These estates were agricultural factories, economies of scale made manifest. They employed hundreds, sometimes thousands of enslaved laborers who worked the groves and operated massive industrial-scale pressing facilities that ran almost continuously during the harvest season. The wealth generated by a single successful latifundium was staggering. The owner wasn't just selling a local product, they were supplying a commodity to the entire empire, with a guaranteed market in the city of Rome's million-plus inhabitants. The profits from this trade allowed the senatorial class to build their palatial homes, fund political careers, and live a life of unparalleled luxury, creating a feedback loop where agricultural wealth translated directly into political power. This concentration of land and production also had a darker side, as it often pushed smaller, independent farmers off their land, creating a landless urban poor who would become reliant on the state for their very survival. This reliance brings us to one of the most ingenious and critical uses of olive oil as a tool of fiscal policy and social control. The Roman state had an insatiable appetite for revenue to pay its armies, build its roads, and administer its vast territories. While taxes were typically collected in coin, there were instances, especially in provinces that were major producers, where taxes could be paid in kind, that is, with goods instead of money. A province like Hispania Baetica in Spain might fulfill a portion of its tax obligation to Rome by shipping thousands of amphorae of olive oil directly to the state warehouses. This was a brilliantly efficient system. It saved the provincial administration the trouble of converting local crops into cash, and it provided the Roman government with a vital commodity it needed anyway. The state could then use this oil to supply its legions stationed on distant frontiers like Hadrian's Wall, where local sources were non-existent. A soldier's pay included a ration of food, and olive oil was a fundamental part of that ration, providing essential calories and fats. By collecting taxes and oil, the state effectively created a supply chain that fed its own military machine, turning the economic output of peaceful provinces into the fuel for imperial expansion and defense. But the most profound economic and social role of olive oil was played out in the very heart of the empire, the city of Rome, to prevent unrest among the vast population of unemployed or underemployed plebeians. The Roman state developed the annona, a massive state-sponsored grain dole. Initially, this system provided citizens with a monthly allowance of wheat, enough to make bread and prevent starvation. However, as the system matured and became more sophisticated, the dole was expanded to include other essential commodities, and olive oil was among the most important. By the height of the empire, the Emperor Septimius Severus instituted a regular distribution of free oil to the populace. This was a political masterstroke. The emperor was now not just guaranteeing that the people had bread, he was providing them with the very substance that made that bread palatable and their lives comfortable. He was giving them the means to cook, to light their homes, and to maintain basic hygiene. This created a powerful, direct bond of patronage between the emperor and the common citizen, bypassing the traditional aristocracy. The message was clear: it is the emperor, through his control of the empire's resources, who ensures your well-being. The logistics of this operation were mind-boggling. The state had to procure, transport, store, and distribute millions of liters of oil every year. This required a vast bureaucracy and gave the emperor immense economic leverage. He could grant lucrative contracts to friendly merchants, influencing trade across the Mediterranean. The distribution points throughout the city became centers of imperial patronage, where the people physically received the bounty of their ruler. In this way, olive oil transcended its role as a mere commodity. It became a currency of political stability, a tool that helped keep the peace in the world's first megalopolis by ensuring that the masses were fed, anointed, and content. The flow of oil into Rome was as critical to the empire's survival as the flow of water in its aqueducts. It was quite literally the lubrication that prevented the grinding gears of society from seizing up. Yet for all their engineering genius, the Romans knew that technology alone could not guarantee success. Behind every turn of the screw and every carefully stacked mat lay the ever-present fear of the unknown, a sudden frost that could decimate the blossoms, a hidden rot that could spoil the paste, or a press that might inexplicably fail under strain. In a world where nature held the ultimate power, the farmer's relationship with his machinery was not merely mechanical, it was deeply spiritual. The press itself, the great torcularium, was more than a collection of wood and stone. It was a living entity, a powerful force that needed to be appeased and honored. This belief gave rise to a unique figure in the Roman pantheon, a specialized deity whose sole domain was this very process, the god of the olive press. While his name has been lost to time in many regions, inscriptions and archaeological finds suggest he was often a local spirit, a genius loci of the pressing floor, sometimes referred to simply as the numen torcularii, the divine spirit of the press. Before the first olive of the season was ever poured into the trapedum, the farmer would lead his household in a ceremony to sanctify the workspace and invoke this god's favor. This wasn't an elaborate state ritual led by priests from Rome, but a simple, heartfelt act of domestic worship. The paterfamilias, as the head of the family, would act as the celebrant. He might lead a procession from the main villa to the pressing facility, carrying offerings. The most common gift was a libation of the previous year's finest oil, poured directly onto the central stone of the press or into a small, purpose-built altar niche in the wall. This act was profoundly symbolic. It was an offering of the very substance they hoped to create, a gift of the past to ensure the bounty of the future. Along with the oil, they might offer a garland of olive leaves, a few grains of salt, or even a small cake. The accompanying prayer would not have been a complex chant, but a direct, practical plea. They would ask the god to keep the wooden beam from cracking under pressure, to ensure the screw turns smoothly, and to bless the paste so that it would yield a high quantity of clear, flavorful oil. It was a contract of sorts. Accept this offering, and in return, grant us your protection and assistance. This intertwining of faith and function didn't end with the initial ceremony. Superstition permeated the entire pressing season, governing the behavior of everyone on the farm. The pressing floor was considered a sacred space, and certain actions were strictly forbidden to avoid offending the presiding spirit. Loud arguments or profane language near the press were thought to bring bad luck, potentially causing the oil to turn rancid. A woman who was menstruating might be barred from the torcularium, not out of disrespect, but from a belief that her condition introduced a disruptive spiritual impurity that could interfere with the delicate chemical process of separation. Even the success of the first pressing was seen as an omen. If the initial flow of oil was strong and golden green, it was a sign of the god's favor, and a small amount might be set aside as a sacred reserve, never to be sold but kept for future rituals or used to anoint the family's household gods, the lares. Conversely, if the press jammed or the oil emerged cloudy, it was interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, perhaps indicating a forgotten offering or a ritual misstep. In response, the farmer might immediately halt work to perform another, more earnest libation, seeking to mend the relationship with the prickly spirit of the machine. This constant dialogue between the practical and the supernatural reveals a world where human effort and divine will were partners in every enterprise. The Romans did not see their advanced technology as separate from their faith. Instead, they believed that the god inhabited the press itself, and that his cooperation was the final, indispensable ingredient needed to transform the humble olive into the liquid gold that sustained an empire. While the great stone presses and cleverly designed amphorae were marvels of engineering, they were ultimately inert objects. The true power behind this vast industry, the relentless force that kept the presses groaning and the oil flowing, was human labor. We must shift our focus from the machinery to the people whose sweat and skill literally powered the production of this liquid gold. The torcularium was not an automated factory. It was a space dominated by intense physical exertion, a world of dust, noise, and grueling shifts that stretched from dawn until dusk. At the very foundation of this workforce were the enslaved men, women, and children who formed the backbone of the entire operation. Their lives were inextricably tied to the relentless rhythm of the harvest. During the pressing season, their days were an endless cycle of hauling heavy baskets of olives, feeding the trapedum, stacking the fibrous mats under the great press, and skimming the oil from the settling vats. The work was not only backbreaking but also dangerous. The sheer weight of the stones and beams posed a constant risk of crushing injury. The air was thick with a fine, oily mist and the acrid smell of fermenting pulp, a constant assault on the lungs. For these individuals, the olive harvest was not a seasonal event but a period of intensified toil, a time when their bodies were pushed to the absolute limit to meet the insatiable demands of their owners and the market. Yet within this harsh system, a hierarchy of skill and responsibility existed. While many slaves performed brute force labor, others developed specialized knowledge that made them incredibly valuable assets. An experienced slave who understood the precise moment to stop the milling in the trapedum to avoid crushing the pits, or who knew exactly how much pressure to apply during the first pressing to maximize quality, was worth his weight in gold. Such a skilled worker might be entrusted with overseeing a shift at the press or maintaining the equipment. This expertise could sometimes lead to a degree of privilege or, for a fortunate few, the possibility of manumission, being freed by their master. This is where we encounter another crucial figure in the Roman agricultural world, the freedmen or libertus. Upon gaining their freedom, many of these individuals did not leave the world of olive oil. Instead, they often stayed on in a managerial capacity. A freedman who had spent his life mastering every nuance of oil production was the ideal candidate to become the villicus, the estate manager. In this role, he acted as the direct representative of the absentee owner, a senator living in far-off Rome. The villicus was responsible for everything: organizing the harvest, supervising the enslaved workforce, maintaining the equipment, and ensuring the final product met quality standards for market. He was a man caught between two worlds, wielding significant authority over the slaves he had once worked alongside, yet ultimately accountable to his former master. His success ensured the profitability of the estate and could lead to his own accumulation of wealth and social standing, a powerful incentive in a society that highly valued economic success. Beyond the large slave-run plantations, a different reality existed for the small-scale independent farmer, the head of a family working a modest plot of land. For this farmer, the olive harvest was not about generating vast wealth for an absent owner. It was about survival and maintaining a fragile autonomy. His operation was a family affair. He, his wife, and their children would work side by side in their own grove, harvesting the olives with poles and nets, perhaps even using a smaller hand-operated press. The oil they produced might be enough to supply their own household for the year, with a small surplus to sell at a local market or to a traveling merchant. This provided a crucial source of cash to pay taxes, purchase goods they couldn't produce themselves, and hopefully save a little for harder times. However, the existence of these smallholders was perpetually precarious. They lived in the economic shadow of the massive latifundia, the great estates that could produce oil on an industrial scale and sell it at lower prices, effectively dominating the market. A single bad harvest, a bout of disease in the olive trees, or an unexpected tax burden could force a small farmer into debt. The only source of a loan was often the owner of a nearby latifundia, who might seize the farmer's land if he couldn't repay. This cycle continually fed the growth of the large estates at the expense of the independent citizen farmer, a social tension that worried Roman moralists for centuries. The story of Roman olive oil is therefore also a story of these competing models of production, the highly efficient but impersonal slave latifundium system versus the resilient but vulnerable family farm. To truly grasp the human experience, we must listen for the individual voices, even if they reach us only faintly through the centuries. Archaeology provides us with poignant, tangible evidence of these lives. In the ruins of a pressing facility at a Roman villa, we might find a small, discreet room adjacent to the main work floor. This would have been the sleeping quarters for the enslaved workers, a cramped, dark space with simple pallets on the floor, a stark contrast to the spacious, frescoed rooms of the main villa. Even more direct are the rare inscriptions left by the people themselves. A touching example comes from a tombstone erected by a freedman for his wife. The inscription proudly states that he was an opportunist, a dealer in autumn fruits, including olives. This simple professional title tells a story of upward mobility, of a man who used his knowledge of the trade to build a new life and a business after gaining his freedom. Then there is the literary voice of someone like Columbia, a first-century AD writer on agriculture. While he was a landowner himself, his writing reflects a practical, almost paternalistic concern for the well-being of the workforce. He advises other estate owners to provide their slaves with adequate clothing and food, not out of pure kindness, but because a healthy, reasonably content worker is more productive. He even suggests giving them small plots of land to cultivate for themselves as an incentive. These fragments, the cramped room, the proud title on a tombstone, the pragmatic advice from a manual, allow us to see beyond the machinery and the economics. They remind us that the river of oil that flowed into Rome was the product of countless individual lives, each with their own hopes, skills, and struggles. Their collective effort embodied in every drop that fueled the lamps, anointed the bodies, and dressed the food of the ancient world. However, the great lever press, for all its power, had significant limitations. The amount of pressure it could exert was ultimately finite, determined by the sheer mass of stone weights that could be hung from the beam. More importantly, it was a blunt instrument, difficult to control with any real finesse. Applying too much force too quickly could generate excessive heat through friction, which would degrade the oil's quality, or worse, crush the olive pits that had been so carefully preserved during milling, releasing bitter tannins that could spoil the entire batch. This lack of control meant that maximizing yield often came at the cost of quality, a trade-off that pragmatic Roman farmers were willing to make for bulk production, but one that limited the potential for premium grades. The quest for more efficient, controllable method would drive one of the most significant agricultural innovations of the ancient world. The solution emerged not from a void, but from the cross-pollination of ideas that characterized the expanding Roman Republic. The principle of the screw had been known for centuries, famously used in devices like the olive press invented by the Greek philosopher Archimedes. However, it was the Romans, with their unparalleled talent for practical engineering and large-scale application, who refined and popularized the screw press, transforming it into the standard for olive oil production across the Mediterranean. The transition from the lever to the screw was a genuine revolution in food technology. Imagine the new setup. Instead of a massive, counterweighted beam, the central feature was an enormous wooden screw, its threads meticulously carved by skilled carpenters. This screw passed vertically through a fixed horizontal timber beam that was anchored to two sturdy stone or brick pillars. Directly beneath the screw was the stack of fibrous mats filled with olive paste. A large wooden cap was placed on top of the stack, and the bottom of the screw would press down onto this cap. The operation was a marvel of mechanical advantage. A long wooden handspike was inserted into a hole at the top of the screw. A team of workers, or sometimes a patient donkey walking in a circle, would turn this handspike. With each rotation, the screw descended incrementally, applying a steady, immense, and crucially controllable downward force on the stack of mats. This controllability was the screw press's greatest advantage. The operator could begin with a gentle pressure, squeezing out the finest free-run oil, the oleum ex albus olevis, without damaging the delicate paste. Then gradually he could increase the pressure, turning the screw further to extract the secondary, more utilitarian grades. This graduated pressing allowed for a clear separation of oil qualities from a single batch of paste, maximizing both the yield of premium oil and the total volume extracted, all while minimizing the risk of overheating or pit crushing. The groaning of the wooden screw and the creak of the fibers under this immense, focused pressure became the new soundtrack of the Roman torcularium, a sound that signaled greater efficiency and higher profits. The adoption of the screw press had profound economic repercussions that rippled far beyond the pressing floor. By significantly increasing the amount of oil that could be extracted from a given quantity of olives, the technology directly boosted the profitability of every olive grove in the empire. Estates could now meet the soaring demand of urban centers like Rome without having to constantly expand their cultivable land. This increase in efficiency also had an impact on labor. While the press still required a crew to operate, the screw mechanism allowed for a greater output per worker hour compared to the cumbersome process of hauling and securing massive stone weights on a lever press. This reduction in relative labor costs further enriched the owners of large latifundia and made olive oil a more affordable commodity for the average Roman citizen. The screw press became so synonymous with Roman agricultural prowess that its design spread to every corner of the empire, from the sunny hillsides of Hispania to the fertile valleys of North Africa. Variations and improvements continue to appear, including the addition of double screws for even greater power or the use of metal components to reinforce the wooden screw threads and increase durability. This relentless refinement demonstrates a core Roman value, the continuous pursuit of practical improvement, where a better machine was not an abstract goal but a direct path to greater wealth and stability. The evolution from the lever to the screw was more than just a technical upgrade. It was a key factor in scaling up production to truly imperial levels, ensuring that the river of liquid gold never ran dry. The creak of the ship's timbers and the salty tang of the Tiber mixing with the sea air were as familiar to Lucius as the lines on his own hands. For him, the sprawling port of Ostia was not a marvel of engineering, but an office, a battlefield, and a second home. Before the sun had even fully cleared the rooftops, he was already at work in his warehouse, a cavernous space near the docks whose very atmosphere was thick with the rich, peppery scent of his livelihood. Today was a sampling day. A newly arrived shipment of amphorae from his cousin's estate in Baetica had been unloaded the night before, and their quality needed verification before a single sestertius could be negotiated. A potential buyer, a wholesaler who supplied the baths and cheaper popani of Rome's Subura district, was due to arrive shortly. Lucius's foreman, a burly freedman named Marcus who had started his life hauling these very jars, carefully tipped one of the amphorae, its pointed base cradled in a wooden frame. Using a long, slender bronze simpulum, a tasting ladle, Lucius drew a small amount of the golden liquid. He first warmed the cup in his hand, releasing the oil's aroma, then brought it to his nose. A good, strong smell of fresh grass and artichokes, a promising start. He then poured a tiny pool onto a piece of plain, unsalted bread, observing its color, a vibrant green gold, before taking a bite. The initial fruitiness gave way to a distinct, pleasant peppery kick at the back of his throat. This was a solid second-press oil, perfect for his client's needs. Not the exquisite oleum ex albis ulivis he reserved for his most discerning patrician clients, but a reliable, flavorful product that would hold up well in cooking and turn a decent profit. The arrival of the wholesaler, a shrewd man named Gaius with a perpetual squint from years of assessing goods in dimly lit warehouses, began the real dance of the day. The initial greetings were cordial, but both men knew the conversation was a subtle duel. Gaius immediately pointed out a slight cloudiness in the sample, a sign of minimal sediment, suggesting a slightly rushed decantation process. Lucius countered by emphasizing the robust flavor and the excellent price point, knowing full well that the cloudiness would settle and was irrelevant for the intended use. They haggled not just over price per amphora, but over the terms of delivery. Would Lucius arrange and cover the cost of the barge transport up the Tiber to the buyer's warehouse in Rome? Or would Gaius send his own men? What was the timeline for payment? Half now, half upon delivery, or a full settlement in 30 days? Every detail was a point of negotiation, a calculation of risk and trust. Lucius had to weigh the certainty of a slightly lower price against the risk of holding onto the inventory longer, with the ever-present threat of a competing shipment from North Africa undercutting him next week. A successful deal was not just about the immediate profit, it was about maintaining a relationship, ensuring that Gaius would return to him first the next time he needed to replenish his stock. Once the deal was struck, marked by a handshake and the notation of terms on a wax tablet by a scribe, the logistical frenzy began. Lucius's work was far from over. He had to coordinate with the Sacarii, the powerful guild of dockworkers whose exclusive right it was to move cargo on the Austrian docks. A miscalculation here could be costly. These men were not employees, they were a force of nature, and their foreman expected a respectful negotiation for their services. Lucius had to ensure his amphorae were handled carefully. A cracked jar was a total loss, and loaded efficiently onto the correct river barge. Meanwhile, he had to secure the necessary documentation. A customs agent, a minor official with the power to cause significant delays, needed to inspect the cargo and affix his lead seal, confirming the taxes had been assessed. Lucius made sure a small gratuity, a perfectly normal incentive for prompt service, was discreetly available to smooth this process along. His mind was a whirlwind of simultaneous calculations: the tide schedule for the barges, the availability of storage space at the destination, the reliability of the captain he was hiring. One misconnection could mean his oil sat spoiling on a sun-baked wharf for days. Yet amidst all this commercial hustle, a merchant's greatest asset was his network of information. Between meetings, Lucius would stroll through the crowded docks, his eyes constantly scanning the newly arrived ships. He would exchange quick greetings with other merchants, sharing tidbits of news picked up from ship captains just in from Alexandria or Carthage. Had a late frost damaged the harvest in Greece? Was there talk of increased piracy near Sicily that might drive up insurance costs? This informal intelligence network was his early warning system. Hearing a rumor that a large, unexpected shipment of cheaper Libyan oil was due to arrive in a fortnight would force him to adjust his pricing strategy immediately, perhaps urging him to sell his current stock at a slightly lower margin to avoid being stuck with it. For Lucius, the price of oil was not set by a central authority. It was a living, breathing thing that fluctuated with the weather, politics, and sheer luck on the high seas. His success depended less on the quality of his oil alone and more on his ability to navigate this constant, chaotic flow of commerce, to read the subtle signs in the port's chaotic symphony, and to make 100 small, correct decisions before most men in Rome had even finished their morning bread. Even after the final, forceful pressing that squeezed out the last drops of low-grade oil, the process was still not complete. What remained in the press was a dense, dry cake of crushed pulp, skins, and fragmented pits, a substance known as pomace. To a modern eye, this leftover material might look like nothing more than waste, the exhausted remains of a finished operation, but for the Romans, whose entire agricultural philosophy was built on the principle of maximum utility, pomace was far from worthless. It was in fact a valuable secondary resource, and its careful management showcases their remarkably waste-conscious approach. Throwing anything away was seen as a loss, an affront to the hard work invested in the harvest. Every component of the olive, from the finest first-press oil to this dry, fibrous cake, had a purpose to serve in the economy of the farm. One of the most important uses for pomace was as a powerful, nutrient-rich fertilizer. Roman farmers had a sophisticated, albeit empirical, understanding of soil health. They knew that continuously growing crops on the same land would eventually deplete its vitality, leading to weaker plants and smaller yields. Pomace provided an excellent solution. After being broken up, the cake was spread across fields and worked into the soil. As it decomposed, it released valuable nutrients, particularly nitrogen and potassium, back into the earth. This acted as a natural soil amendment, improving its structure, helping it retain moisture and preparing it for the next planting season. It was especially beneficial for the very olive groves from which it came, creating a sustainable cycle where the trees fed the soil that in turn fed the trees. This practice of returning organic matter to the land was a form of ancient crop rotation and fertilization that kept the agricultural engine running for generations. The Romans didn't have synthetic chemicals. They had the wisdom to use what their land produced to replenish the land itself. Beyond nourishing the soil, pomace had a very practical and immediate function as a fuel source. In an era before coal or gas, finding efficient materials for heating and cooking was a constant challenge. Wood was the primary fuel, but its supply was not infinite, and deforestation around growing urban centers was already a concern. Pomace, however, was a readily available byproduct. Once thoroughly dried in the sun, these fibrous cakes became highly combustible. They burned with a hot, slow flame, making them ideal for firing the kilns that produced the millions of amphorae needed for the oil trade, or for providing the steady, prolonged heat required in bakery ovens. On a smaller scale, dried pomace was bundled up and used in the hypocaust systems that heated the floors of wealthier villas and public baths, or simply as a reliable fuel for the household hearth. This transformed what could have been a disposal problem into a free and efficient source of thermal energy, reducing the estate's reliance on harvested timber and turning the pressing season's leftovers into the warmth of the winter months. Perhaps the most telling use of pomace, however, speaks to the Romans' determination to leave no potential value untapped and their acute awareness of social stratification. Even after the commercial pressings were finished, a significant amount of oil still clung tenaciously to the solid matter. Recovering this oil wasn't economically viable for the large estates selling to the market. The effort required would have outweighed the financial return. But for subsistence farmers or for the estate owners themselves, this residual oil could be extracted for a very specific purpose. The dry pomace cake would be broken apart and soaked in hot or boiling water. This hydrating process caused the tiny droplets of oil trapped within the cellular structure of the pulp to loosen and rise to the surface. The mixture might then be pressed one final time or simply left to settle, allowing the scant oil to be skimmed off. The resulting liquid was a murky, acidic, and pungent oil, often referred to as amica in a broader sense or simply known as pomace oil. This was the lowest grade of oil imaginable, fit only for the most basic and undemanding uses. It was never meant for the table of anyone who had a choice. Instead, this oil was often distributed as part of the annona, the state grain dole, to the very poorest citizens of Rome, those who could not afford even the cheapest lamp oil from the third pressing. It could be used for lighting, though it would have produced a smoky, foul-smelling flame. It might also have been used for crude soap making or as a leather conditioner. The existence of this practice is a stark reminder of the vast economic disparities in Roman society. While the elite drizzled exquisite green gold oleum ex albis ulivis over their bread, the urban poor made do with this barely palatable residue, a tangible symbol of their place at the bottom of the social ladder. Yet even here the principle of no waste held firm. The very act of creating this low-grade oil from pomace ensured that every possible calorie and every potential use was extracted from the harvest, demonstrating that in the Roman world, true waste was not an option. This remarkable journey from the grove to the amphora might seem like a relic of a distant past, but if you were to step into a traditional olive mill in rural Greece, southern Italy, or Tunisia today, you would be struck by an overwhelming sense of familiarity. The fundamental principles of transforming a bitter olive into golden oil have remained astonishingly unchanged for 2,000 years, while modern technology has introduced stainless steel crushers and centrifugal separators that work with incredible speed. The soul of the process, the very philosophy of extraction, is a direct inheritance from the Romans. The most tangible link is the stone mill. In countless villages across the Mediterranean, you can still find massive granite millstones, turned not by a blindfolded donkey but by a small electric motor, slowly and patiently crushing olives into a coarse paste. The pace is deliberate, a conscious choice to avoid generating heat that would degrade the oil's delicate flavors, echoing the Roman understanding that quality cannot be rushed. The pressing method may have evolved, but the goal is identical to that of the Roman torcularium, to apply just the right amount of pressure to coax out the oil without harming its essence. This continuity extends beyond the machinery to the very heart of the craft, the importance of timing and freshness. A modern master miller will tell you that the highest quality oil, what we call extra virgin, must come from olives that are pressed within hours of harvest. This is not a modern discovery. It is the same urgent race against time that governed every Roman estate. The critical decision of when to harvest, the precise moment of veraison when the olive is neither too green nor too black, is still a judgment call made by experienced farmers, passed down through generations, mirroring the ancient knowledge that determined the value of an entire season's work. Even the grading system we use today has its roots in the Roman multiple press method. Our extra virgin is the direct descendant of the prized oleum ex albis ulivis, the first cold pressing. The standard virgin oil corresponds to their main pressing, and the industrial uses for lower grades persist. The Romans' tiered approach to quality, recognizing that a single fruit could produce oils for different purposes and social classes, was a sophisticated market insight that still structures the global olive oil trade. Perhaps the most profound legacy, however, is not in the process but on the landscape itself. The Romans were instrumental in creating the iconic Mediterranean scenery we cherish today. They identified the ideal terroir for olives, the rocky, sun-drenched hillsides with perfect drainage, and they planted them on a scale never before seen. When you admire the silvery green groves terraced into the hills of Andalusia in Spain or the Peloponnese in Greece, you are often looking at an agricultural system established by Roman colonists. These are not wild landscapes, they are carefully engineered Roman farms, their ancient quincunx planting patterns sometimes still faintly visible. The Romans' practice of intercropping olives with vines and grains created a sustainable, diverse ecosystem that defined rural life in the region for centuries. The very fact that countries like Spain, Italy, and Greece are now the world's leading producers of olive oil is a direct result of Roman agricultural policy and colonization. They didn't just make oil, they sculpted the environment to optimize its production, leaving a living, productive monument that continues to shape economies and diets. So the next time you uncork a bottle of extra virgin olive oil and that sharp, grassy aroma hits your senses, take a moment to appreciate the depth of history you're holding. That vibrant flavor is a taste of Roman ingenuity. The simple act of drizzling it over a salad connects you to a 2,000-year-old chain of knowledge, from the farmer who judged the perfect ripeness to the engineer who designed the screw press. The oil in your kitchen is more than an ingredient. It is a living artifact, a thread that runs unbroken from the bustling port of Ostia to your modern table. It is a testament to the enduring power of a brilliant idea, proving that while empires may rise and fall, the pursuit of perfecting something as simple and essential as olive oil is a legacy that truly stands the test of time. And so this remarkable journey from a humble fruit on a windswept hillside to the very lifeblood of civilization reaches its final destination. We have followed the olive from the sacred grove through the ingenious machinery of the Roman press, across the treacherous sea in its cleverly designed amphora, and into the heart of the empire itself. But the true impact of this liquid gold is measured not in the individual steps, but in the collective force it unleashed upon the ancient world. Olive oil was the invisible engine of Rome, a substance so versatile that it simultaneously touched the highest realms of divinity and the most basic necessities of daily survival. It was the fuel that illuminated the long nights, allowing scholars to study and businesses to thrive after sunset. It was the cleanser that anointed the bodies of citizens in the public baths, promoting hygiene and social cohesion on a massive scale. It was the calorie-rich sustenance that fed the mighty legions stationed on distant, hostile frontiers, turning a simple ration of bread and lentils into a meal that could power the expansion and defense of an empire spanning 3 continents. More than just a practical commodity, olive oil became a powerful currency of both economics and politics. The staggering scale of its production on vast slave-run estates generated fortunes that built the great villas and funded the political careers of the senatorial elite. The state's brilliant decision to incorporate it into the public dole transformed it into a tool of social control, a direct gift from the emperor to the people that helped maintain peace in the crowded, volatile city of Rome. The mountain of broken amphorae at Monte Testaccio stands today as a silent, crumbling monument to this consumption, a physical archive of an economic system sophisticated enough to track shipments with the precision of a modern barcode. The river of oil that flowed into the capital was as critical to its stability as the water in its aqueducts. It greased the wheels of commerce, fueled the machinery of government, and literally kept the lamps of an entire civilization burning for centuries. So the next time you reach for that bottle of extra virgin olive oil in your own kitchen, pause for a moment before you pour. Look at the golden green liquid within, not just as a simple cooking ingredient, but as a capsule of history. That vibrant, peppery flavor is a direct sensory link to an ancient world of ingenuity and ambition. You are holding the culmination of 2,000 years of accumulated knowledge, from the Roman farmer who knew the exact moment to harvest, to the engineer who perfected the screw press, to the merchant who braved the open sea to bring this precious cargo to market. The story of Rome is often told in marble and legionary steel, but its true beating heart was agricultural, economic, and profoundly human. It was built on the foundation of something as simple and essential as the olive. That bottle on your shelf is more than just oil. It is a legacy, a taste of the incredible ingenuity and relentless drive that once powered an empire, a reminder that the greatest forces in history can often be found in the most ordinary of places.